All right, Tom, take it away, please.
Thank you, Lou. Welcome to all, especially to those of you who are with us for the first time this evening. I'm delighted that my friend Herb Lynn has agreed to come back. He spoke at a Great Decisions program a few years ago that on many of the subjects, I think I know enough to give a talk, a credible talk. This is not one of them. So I am delighted to learn from Herb's presentation. I heard him give one on the impact on nuclear the security issues of about 2 weeks ago. And as you will quickly discover, he knows a great deal. Dr. Lynn is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, where I am also a fellow, and has an appointment at the Hoover Institution after decades, I guess, at the National Academies, where he worked primarily on cyber issues and has worked on the nuclear enterprise in the United States. So what we're going to do this evening is different from other sessions in this series, in that mostly we're going to do this as a dialogue, that I'll invite Herb to give any introductory remarks that he wants to make. And then we'll proceed with me asking questions and Herb reframing that question as he thinks is appropriate and responding to it. And then we will open it up to people here and on Zoom. So without taking any more of Herb's time, let me invite you, Herb, turn the computer so people can see you and open us up with any remarks that you'd like to.
Just that I'm glad to be here and I'm looking forward to this.
Can
Take it
people
away.
hear?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that better? All right. Just that in opening remarks, I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to this. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Well, let me ask the first question, which is get everybody on the same level. And it's simply, what exactly is artificial intelligence? And does it deserve all the hype that it has received the last few years?
The real answer to that is it depends, and you'll find that that's sort of the magic phrase in all of this. And anybody asks you this sort of question, it is always it depends. And so let's try to unpack that a little bit. What is artificial intelligence? Well, originally, artificial intelligence was defined in 1955, 56 or so, as the ability to give machines, computers, the ability to do certain things that we would normally associate with human beings. Okay, so that's one perfectly good definition of that, and it's the definition that I actually always go back to. What are some examples of artificial intelligence? I am certain that all of you have used a calculator, right? The term, the word calculator used to be a job description, right? People were paid, mostly women, were paid to do calculations in the 1930s and 40s and so on. So this, and it took real skill, real ability, human intelligence to do, and the calculators could do, that. And so you could argue the calculators are artificial intelligence. And nobody thinks of it that way, but it is. I'll bet that every one of you has used a word processor, has typed something into a computer. And maybe you've lived with the auto-correct function, which purports to correct your spelling errors, right? So how many of you have ever typed TEH instead of THE, right? I mean, all of you have done that, right? but you sort of don't notice it because the computer fixes it for you. That's artificial intelligence too. Okay. So autocomplete, when you type into, most of you have used Google searches, and you type in a phrase and it suggests 6 or 7 possibilities for you. That's also artificial intelligence, right? And what do I mean by artificial intelligence? I mean that the way the people program the computer to do that uses techniques that are often studied under today's rubric of artificial intelligence. Nobody studies how to build a calculator anymore. Okay. There's no computer science student who knows how to build a calculator anymore. That's fine. I mean, you can get it for $6 at CVS. Nobody cares anymore. But it's so AI can go from the mundane that we've just talked about all the way up to, I live up in San Francisco. Okay, Waymo has taken over the streets. Everywhere I go now, I see a Waymo without a driver. It's still sort of an amazing thing. Okay, there has not been a single fatality from Waymo in millions of miles. Okay, that's pretty amazing. I still don't think Waymo is ready for prime time personally as a user. We'll get into that in a minute. But it's a remarkable thing that this car can navigate itself along the streets of San Francisco, especially with the crazy drivers in San Francisco, right? You all know this, right? And so that's also AI. And in fact, anywhere you could use a computer, which means really for any application that you could use where information is useful in doing your job, in principle, you could use some form of AI. Okay, so it has widespread applicability. I could get into the techniques for it. Doesn't really, if we want to, we can talk a little bit about that, but it doesn't really matter. The point is they can be used across a whole range of applications. Everything that uses information, everything where there's a chip in it, everything where there's a computer that could be applicable. I think that's a short answer to your question.
How does this differ from kind of glorified or automated crowdsourcing?
Well, okay. There are many techniques that are used to program a computer to show or to demonstrate artificial intelligence. As we talked about earlier, sort of the logic and the programming of a calculator is part of, could be considered part of that. For some of the techniques, some of the most powerful techniques that are used today, there's a reliance on data. Data for what? Data can give you examples for what the machine is supposed to do. Okay. And the machine is set up in such a way that it learns from these examples. Now, we also know how to make 7-pound computers that learn independently. They're called babies, right? Babies learn too. And in fact, babies learn from just a few examples. And if you have, if you dealt with a 4-year-old kid trying to learn language, they can learn language pretty easily with just a few examples. It takes computers thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of examples. They're crowdsourcing, is what you mean, to get, whereas kids can learn this very quickly. Nobody understands how kids do this. Okay, and this is in fact one of the outstanding problems in AI research. How do you get a computer to be able to learn with just a few examples rather than millions of examples? Because we have a clear example of computers that can do it, the biological computers, babies. They know how to do this. So is this, I mean, when you say glorified automated crowdsourcing, I think what you mean by that is that it uses data from a lot of places. So the way ChatGPT or something gets information is that it goes over to the internet and mines all the information that's out there. It just goes to search and looks at text after text after text after text and learns, quote, learns. Well, it's in fact not learning anything. It's basically compiling a list, essentially, of words, and then there are different other words that can follow it. There are ballpark of 100,000 words in the English language. That's a lot, but let's pretend that number is true. And in principle, any one of those 100,000 words could come after it. Okay, so, but to say, it's more likely that if the first word is thank, T-H-A-N-K, the next word has a high probability of being you and a very low probability of being the word zebra. Right? I mean, I think you would all agree with that. And you can imagine conceptually, for every word, what's the probability that a certain other word will come after that? And that's a number. Okay. And then conceptually, you can imagine a pair of two words, and then another word after that. What's the probability of a third word? Okay. United States of America. Of is highly likely rather than on or something like that. Okay. And you can imagine doing this. Now, the problem is since there's so many words in the English language, the number of there's not an example of all of this stuff out in the net. So what happens in practice is that you have to come up with ways of estimating what all those probabilities are. And that's where you get into some magic, technical magic about how you make inferences about how likely something is afterwards. But that's essentially all ChatGPT, that's all the underlying model is doing. And what that means is that it's not actually learning anything. I think one of the things we know about babies and infants and toddlers learning language is that they generate rules for themselves. And of course, once you have the rule, it's a lot easier to make predictions. That's what grammar is about. You put an S after a word to make it plural. I mean, that kind of thing. So
How does AI handle things like non-standard uses of common words? I used to have fun with non-native English speakers that insisted they were perhaps better than I thought they were. I said, what's a lemon? And the answer is, of course, a fruit. They said, no, a lemon is a car that does not function properly. She's a peach doesn't mean she's a fruit. What's a strawberry? You scrape.
Right.
You see where I'm
Right.
going here. And one of the characteristics of English is we have lots and lots of double entendre words.
Right?
How does AI learn that?
Badly. I mean, the answer is that there are, yes, there are enough examples of many of these unusual meanings out there. They're not as common as the usual one, but there's a lot. And it makes inference, and it's less reliable on those. So, I mean, I think that's the fairest answer to that. It isn't very good. It doesn't understand anything. It's just a bunch of statistics. And right now, a lot of people are working very hard on trying to give it some sort of understanding, some sort of meaning, and so that it will actually understand. Then you can get into debates about what it means to understand, but never mind that for the moment.
But to make sure I'm understanding correctly, that as you are using statistic, it's just a number, these are probabilities that are built into algorithms that have
No.
learned, what do you mean?
By statistics, by the probabilities that, what's the likelihood that you follows thank rather than zebras? Okay. That's a number. The way the model gets that number is it does it empirically. It looks out on the web. If it didn't have all those examples on the web, it couldn't tell you what the number was. That's basically how it works. It's what it is. It only knows what it's been fed.
So it's the empirical result of having scanned a whole bunch and
That's
you got
correct.
a large number or
That's
small
correct.
number.
That's correct. That's correct.
Thank you. That how autonomous is AI in two senses? One is its ability to act without kind of continuous reprogramming, updating, refreshing of the question. The other way in which I mean autonomous is what else does it need in order to be applied? That you need certain kinds of equipment and settings and training of people, that is it a magic bullet, or is it one more component in an ever more complex array of other ancillary prerequisites?
Okay. So on the first, when you say how, you said, how does it, in some sense, how can it learn on its own? I think that was the implication of what you were saying. And so to do that, let me give you some examples. One way of doing it, of training an AI, let's say what I want to do is, am I okay for? Oh, okay, sorry. There's always a problem with the technology, isn't there? There's, let's say the problem is trying to distinguish pictures of animals and trying to distinguish what animal is in the picture. Okay, cats, dogs, monkeys, whatever. Okay, and so what you do conceptually is you feed it pictures, and you say, this is a dog, this is a cat, this is a monkey, this is a cat, this is a monkey, this is a dog, and so on. That's called supervised learning. And it learns from these examples. By the way, there are instances where people learn how to do this. Okay, so there is a profession. This is a true story. There's a profession called chicken sexing. It's a skill, actually. What chicken sexers do is that they're very good at examining a baby chick right out of the shell, and determining whether it's male or female. You can understand for economic reasons, farmers want to know whether this chick is a female or a male. And the way they teach is this conceptually, is they put these baby chicks on a conveyor belt. And the novice chicken sexer sits there next to an expert chicken sexer. And the novice chicken sexer guesses, looks at it, holds it, examines it, says male. The expert says, nope, that's a female. Okay. Does the next one, male. Yep, that's male. And next one, female. So by feedback, the person learns. And this process takes 3 weeks. I'm making the number up. It takes 3 weeks. But by the end of that period of time, the 3 weeks, a person can differentiate between male and female chicks at the same level of accuracy as the expert, and has no idea what it is he learned, right? So People do this too. Okay. But anyway, this is supervised learning. There's another kind of learning, which is unsupervised, where the computer looks at a bunch of data, of pictures, and determines for itself what common features are. So this was a big deal 7 or 8 years ago when they were shown to do it. Given huge numbers of animal pictures, and it figured out how to separate cats from dogs and so on. It clustered them on its own. I mean, obviously didn't know the name, the word cat, but it was able to differentiate between different categories. That's another. There are other kinds of learning too, but that's an example of how a machine can continue to learn, assuming it's given more and more data to do it. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
No, but you're answering a question that's
question.
maybe more important
Okay.
than the one I asked, and that to me is the purpose
Okay.
of the dialogue. Let me shift to the topic in the great decisions, which is national security. And lots of commentary
Uh-huh.
has declared AI to be critical to national security.
Mhm.
What does that mean? Does AI make us safer, more secure, or does it make us more vulnerable in other respects? Or does it make us insecure because it might turn into HAL on 2001: A Space Odyssey?
Okay. So again, this is one of those great, it depends. First, you have to talk about what national security is. So there is a tendency among many people to think about national security in mostly military terms, armed forces that fight. So let me make up a completely hypothetical situation, which you'll see has no resemblance at all to reality. Imagine, for example, that the president of the United States was under the influence of some foreign power. Oh, like, I don't know, like Russia, maybe. Okay, just imagine that. I know that's hard to believe, but one could imagine that happening. I think that most people would agree that that's a threat to national security that doesn't have necessarily a military dimension to it. Okay, as I say, completely hypothetical. Another example would be that if a nation was torn apart, could be torn apart by civil war. I don't mean civil war in the sense of shooting, but I mean civil war in the sense of people being utterly uncivil to each other, where if you disagree with me, you're the enemy. Okay, not necessarily one that's worth shooting, but you're the enemy and I don't want to have anything to do with you. Okay? One can imagine that a country that was that had that kind, experienced that kind of political fragmentation was facing a threat to national security if that threat could support, sustain, and even increase that kind of polarization and view of the adversary. Okay. So if you're willing to look at an expanded view of national security, the ways in which you could imagine AI playing becomes, as having an effect on national security, becomes even greater than just the military. So let me go through some of this. Okay. On the military side, well, what would you use AI for? Okay. The military is a big entity. It does a lot of things. You go to the Pentagon, and you look at the, the number of job descriptions that are associated with people in the Pentagon, and it's essentially the yellow pages of a big city, right? You can't name a profession that is in the civilian sector that doesn't have a corresponding person in the military doing that. Okay. And most of these things have to do with information. And in every case, there are artificial intelligence will have or potentially has some effect on how these people will do their jobs. So did you know that that the Department of Defense employs teachers, K-12 teachers? They can employ kindergarten teachers, they're paid by the Department of Defense. So you have to consider, does AI have a role in helping kindergarten teachers? That's an interesting question. Okay. I mean, I have my own personal opinions about that, but they don't matter. I mean, a lot of people have many different opinions about that. And so at least it's arguable, you can imagine that, yes, some people think it should have some role there. Okay. And it has pilots there, and you can imagine AI helping pilots do their jobs and so on. Now, what does it mean to help do their jobs? Well, some people think that AI should replace people, reduce headcount. That has been a traditional way of helping companies and so on reduce the number of people involved, increasing the reliance on technology, increasing productivity, and so on. And you can imagine that in the military too. There are a lot of soldiers looking at screens. Soldiers spend a lot of time in the military looking at a computer screen. Okay. Well, maybe it shouldn't be that way. Maybe a computer should be looking at the computer screen instead and interpreting it and monitoring for changes and so on. You can imagine AI playing a major role in that. Those are perfectly benign sorts of things. Nobody really objects to that. There are some things that you might object to. You might object to a computer saying, yes, it's okay to shoot a missile at that party. Now this is getting a little bit tricky. Okay. Under what circumstances are you willing to give a machine the authority to to identify a target and to launch lethal force against it? This is a big deal, right? Is this thing do you trust the machine enough? Do you trust people enough? Right, well, we go through, we give 18-year-olds machine guns, okay? And we more or less trust them with a lot of training and so on to obey the laws of war, to only fire when and so on. There's a lot that goes into giving an 18-year-old a machine gun. What's the analog of that for giving a computer the authority to fire a machine gun? Okay. And to be perfectly honest, nobody knows the answer to that. Okay. This is a matter of, whereas military training for human beings has been going on for a very long time, people don't know about how to deal with machines to do this. Okay. And it's an area of, significant contention. And of course, a machine gun is not the only weapon that a military has. Okay. Militaries also have these other things called nuclear weapons. Okay. And whether you want to give, a machine the authority to launch a nuclear weapon on its own, no thanks. I think that's not a great idea. But I think that's a different question. Okay. I would understand you could make an argument, a good argument to that effect. Okay, let's just get rid of all the nuclear weapons. We could, you could make that argument, but nobody in the national security establishment is talking about that. Oh, sorry. sorry about that. The person said, when I said, do we want to give machines the ability to launch nuclear weapons? The person in the audience said, well, let's not give people that authority either. Okay, that's a perfectly reasonable comment to make, but as they say, out of scope for this discussion. Okay, you know, it's a perfectly legitimate debate. But you know, if you're saying should computers be able to do, you can make a good argument that says yes. You can make a good argument that says no. What's the argument for yes? An argument for yes is you can imagine people, human beings with the ability to launch nuclear weapons acting impulsively, right? Are there national leaders that you can think of who might be impulsive? I mean, I don't know, maybe, right? It's possible, okay? Or motivated out of revenge or personal pique. Can you imagine that? Okay, well, maybe a computer wouldn't do that. Okay, you could imagine that, but you know, that's an argument. Now, how you would guarantee a computer would do the right thing under the right circumstances and so on is hard to know, because at least in part, because we don't ourselves know what the right thing to do is. It's not fair, really, to ask a computer to make a decision that and judge its correctness when we're not sure what the right answer is either, when there is debate about it, no consensus. There are some people in this room, I am sure, who would say you should never, ever, ever fire a nuclear weapon under any circumstances, even if you were attacked first. I have dear friends who believe that. And I have other friends who believe just the opposite. That is, there are some times that it would make sense to fire a nuclear weapon even before somebody else fires at their own. And you can make a good case on both sides of that. So, Tom.
Picking up on that, can AI now or conceivably reduce the scope of uncertainty for human-made decisions as well as for machine-made decisions? Is there something inherent in the construct of artificial intelligence that reduces the uncertainty of all kinds of actions and potential actions? Or is it just, you know, another kind of better informed way of making decisions?
Well, AI is as good as the information you give to it. I think that people would say, but then again, people are too, right? Can you imagine AI reducing the scope of uncertainty? Well, you can imagine that AI might be able to come up with a decision-making, with decisions comparable to what a human would make in a shorter amount of time. If you can imagine that, that means you can imagine also a larger amount of time for collecting information to feed the decision. So let's say today, pretend that today we have 20 minutes to make a decision. So you have 10 minutes to get all the data and 10 minutes to make the decision. If you could make the decision in 5 minutes, then you'd have 15 minutes to collect all the data, to collect more data and feed it in, and then come out with an equivalent decision at the end of your 20-minute time. So that's one way in which, in principle, it might be able to help. That's the hope of a lot of advocates who believe that artificial intelligence will help commanders. Now, unfortunately, I don't believe it's going to work like that in practice, okay? Because if there are, let's say you had this, this 20-minute window, and AI could let you you take 10 minutes to get all the data, and then you could compress the time of, of decision making from 10 minutes to 5 minutes. That means the whole process could take 15 minutes. And they would say, oh, I can act 5 minutes faster. And so I think that's what will happen. I don't think they'll take the extra 5 minutes to get more data. I think they'll use the extra 5 minutes to get advantage over the other guy, because acting faster and more is better.
Is there an analog? Like the computer, AI, we're treating them as unitary actors, but Tom and Herb weight the evidence or some parts of that evidence differently.
Right.
We come out with different judgments. We come out with different prescriptions on what to do it. Their whole set of, which one of us is senior, how many people back you and back me, and
Right.
that kind of. Does AI make that easier? Or do you get dueling AI judgments?
You could imagine that.
Do you build in an alternative view, and then who sorts out which one is best?
That is a very interesting question. I have not heard, I follow these debates reasonably closely, not in micro detail, but in reasonably closely. I have never heard of a scheme which would pose different AIs working together. It's always talked about in terms of one large AI system. Now, in principle, of course, there could be 16 different AIs under this one rubric, in principle. But the way in which decision makers operate, the president will have a conference with, 4 decision makers in the Oval Office. And the president will poll each one of them. Say, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Okay. And the president will decide. That's the job of the president. I have never heard of a proposed arrangement in which you have, in some sense, competing AIs take the role of each of those parties. I haven't heard of that. That doesn't mean they haven't done it. But what is that the in-person decision-making process? It's based on the president's trust of the individuals, what the president knows about the personality characteristics of each one of them, and so on. All those sorts of things, intangibles that are very hard to put into a computer. It's hard to imagine that a president would have that kind of intimate familiarity with one AI, let alone 5 different ones. So what you asked is a very, very good question. And I don't think there's anybody that knows how to understand that situation very well.
I want to go back to the national security dimension of it and ask a overly simplistic question. That does AI hold the promise of making us completely secure? We'll know what anybody else is doing in time to deter it using diplomacy, using preemptive military, whatever it is, or does it risk making us much more vulnerable? Because an Uganda, an Uruguay can use AI to develop systems that they couldn't possibly do if they had to rely on human talent, industrial capacity. Is this the magic bullet for others, for the weak to deal with the strong, or to make the strong even more powerful, or both?
I think, right. I think the answer is both. Let me talk a little bit about each one. In the case of the smaller nations, what is clear is that if you say, I want to advance my capabilities, and this is true across the board, you can either do it by being able to push the state of the art forward beyond where you would normally have gone, or you can use it to increase the expertise so that people who were previously novices become average or level or expert. So you have I mean, you can do both of those things. Okay. It's very clear that AI helps beginners become better much faster. There's no question about that. What they get to the advanced levels, to the truly expert levels, probably not. But they certainly bring a novice up to speed much more quickly. It's unknown really how far they can push the frontier. There is some evidence that they can, but I suspect that the value of equipping, of now having, thousands of people rather than dozens of people being able to think at a higher level is going to be much more significant. That's my own personal judgment. There are other people who disagree with that. So it's clear that it's going to increase the capabilities of anybody else, of the smaller nations. Does it help the larger nations? Well, it will in many ways. It'll help them at the state of the art and so on, and that will be good. The idea that you'll get, in some sense, total situational awareness, which is the sort of thing that you're thinking about. Again, that's only a question of sensors. That's what you need to do. You need to instrument the entire world to get more information, and then you have to understand it. And so I suspect there the issue is getting the sensor information and making sure that it's reliable. Now, the problem with this approach is that when you try to increase the capability of your system to encompass a lot more data, a lot more different kinds of data points, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about, now you have a sensor in the prime minister's office in Uganda or something like that. Well, one, you have to know that the president of Uganda hasn't detected it and is not feeding you nonsense. Okay. The second thing is that with more sensors, what you're adding to is for lack of a better term, the complexity, the computational complexity of the system to ingest all of this information. And it turns out, no reason that you would know this, but it turns out that the complexity of this rises in such a way, becomes much more difficult, much harder to process, faster than you can add on more and more processors to do it. And so pretty soon your computers are just not adequate to ingest all this information. And it's not just a question of waiting till next year's model comes out. Okay, it goes up so much faster that waiting until next year's model isn't going to do it. Okay, it'll take millions of years so that you can do the calculations, and that's not useful for anybody.
Your response reminds me of a oft-repeated set of exchanges that I had when I was the Deputy Director of National Intelligence with folks in the Pentagon who had designed weapon systems that were information hogs, intel hogs, that couldn't operate without enormous amounts of input. And the revolution in sensor technology, collecting, but it all had to go through my analysts, right? To how reliable is this? How do you weight this? That we were the bottleneck in the system. So it was you got to give me more analysts. And I said, no, this is an operations and maintenance problem. You designed a thing, you should have designed in the capacity to, where I'm going with that is that AI has at least the promise of being able to process and evaluate all this data, but the answer that you just gave reinforces my bias that a bigger computer does not solve the problem.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. It doesn't solve the problem because, well, and there are good reasons, there are mathematically demonstrable reasons why it doesn't solve the problem. The field for anybody listening here is called computational complexity. And there's a lot of people who know, you've all heard about Moore's law, right? The fact that computers get faster and faster every year. Well, first of all, Moore's law is starting to slow down, but never mind that. Every analyst and general has heard about Moore's law. There isn't 1 in 100 of them that knows anything about computational complexity. And that's the flip side of the problem. Adding more information makes the problem more complicated. And it's very, very difficult to get the computational capability needed to ingest and process even a little bit more information.
We've all heard about the electricity demands for the server farms to support that are going to complicate everything from carbon footprint and climate change to the city has to go dark so we can run this problem on the computer. But apart from that, is the prospect of AI one that's going to cost more to do everything?
What do you mean?
Or that the kinds of supporting infrastructure to let it do decision-making in a manufacturing facility or in the military realm to build systems that can really make use of this in the time allotted. We take these super expensive systems and make them more expensive, or we don't have to put a human being in it. So the airplane doesn't have to cost so much. So is the prospect of sticking to defense here? $1 trillion isn't going to be nearly enough for an AI supported military, or we actually can save some money by building this stuff in. My instincts all tell me it's going to cost more.
I think that's right. And there is no even, okay, so what will happen is that for more capability, you'll have to spend more money. That is true. And so I have yet to see a military that is willing to settle for less capability. Okay, and so they will do it until somebody says they will want more capability until somebody says no. And that's the finiteness of the budget. So and they will give you all the reasons why they deserve more and they should have more and so on, because American lives are at stake and, and so on and so forth. But, no military is ever satisfied with less capability. I mean, that's just the reality. So my instinct is aligned with yours.
One more from me. I've got a lot more questions, but I want to open it up. But my one more question is going back to the broader concept of national security. There are a lot of things that should and usually do enter it. But one of the effects of climate change that are global. They certainly affect every part of our own country. Can AI help in designing strategies to increase resilience, to ameliorate the effects, to keep, my favorite example, keep the San Francisco airport above sea level, that would provide guidance now for spending money without producing really disastrous side effects? Or is this just not sexy enough to do?
Certainly AI could do it, but we already know how to do a lot of these things. We just need the political will to do it. And if an AI says do it, I'm not sure we'll be any more willing to do it than if people say to do it. So I mean, it would be great if we could put some of our solutions in and, we'll sneak them in and then say they're produced by AI, right? Now, I don't know whether these days that would make it more likely or less likely that it would be adopted. So we already know how to do a lot of the stuff that we claim to want to be able to do. Just have to be willing to do it. And that's what's missing in the political discourse.
Okay, let me go. I see a hand in the back, and we'll start here, and Lou will gather on the Zoom participants, and we'll bounce back and forth between the room and Lou. But let me, Scott, do you have a microphone back there? So we need the microphone in order to put it to our Zoom crowd.
Yeah, just like before. Hang on to it till you're done.
Thank you. So you said something about the AI is only as good as the data that feeds it, that is used to train it. And what I've seen a lot of is that engineers will give the system a ton of data and it'll get trained. And then they'll the example of it deciding that Black people are apes or that certain people don't qualify for loans because of something. And at some point, the engineers have lost track of how it's figured out, whatever it's figured out, and they don't know what's happening in the black box. And so they can't retrain it. They can't even understand what biases have been incorporated, what biases have not been. I mean, so essentially it becomes this black box that we hope is doing something we want, but we really have no idea how it's making these decisions. And we also don't know how to fix it. And so that seems like and then the banks or the credit card companies or the insurance companies that are using AI systems to decline or accept things, they'll say, oh, well, the system said, but it doesn't actually make any real sense when people look at it. And that combined with, there was a book that came out recently, like Invisible Women, about how there is really zilch data collected about women in general, in medicine and economics, all sorts of categories. And that has shaped our financial policy and many other decisions. And so I'm particularly thinking that a system that gets trained on data that we don't know how it's operating or what rules. So what are and I would not want to trust national security or decisions about who should be allowed to emigrate or whatever to a system that we don't actually know how it's making the decisions or what data sets were used to train them. So that's my concern. I'd love your thoughts.
Okay, let's keep the microphone with her. This is an opportunity for an interesting dialogue. Okay, so let us posit, which I believe the following. I think you believe the following too. That, for example, women and minorities have been systematically disadvantaged in employment, in employment opportunities, in certain employment opportunities. And historically, that's a true statement. That you can explain the disadvantage in a variety of different ways, but the fact of it, I think, is undeniable. As an outcome, what outcome do you want of an AI? A, do you want it to reproduce historical experience? Or B, do you want it to produce something that is, quote, fairer, unquote? What's your answer to that?
So I would not want an AI system to cement and reproduce and exacerbate the biases that were incorporated into decisions that have been made. So, even something as simple as the GDP choosing not to include home,
Mhm.
services.
Okay.
So my answer would be, I would want, and also I think that if you asked, do you want the system to reproduce the current racial biases? People would say no, right? But
Some people would say no.
some people would say no. So we would hope that the people who were in charge of whatever the fair banking or insurance thing would say, no, we really don't want to be racist about how we approve these things. But the data that exists to train the systems incorporates all those biases.
I agree. Okay, it's
Right.
fine. It's fine. So what you said is that you want to intervene in the decision-making process to give you a result different than what has been true historically. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. You want to intervene in fine. I accept that. I may even want to intervene too, and maybe even in the same direction. Okay. But you'll note that there are other people who would want to not intervene. They're saying that, you have, and I have, a particular political point of view in mind, which you would agree is values laden and so on. It's connected to what our vision of a just society is. Okay. That is a contentious point. And it has, I'll stress, it has nothing to do with AI.
Except for the fact that the people who are building these AI systems don't understand enough to know that they are incorporating or not incorporating the biases. So that's like the top level problem.
But you would have them
Even
intervene.
if they don't agree, right?
You would
To
have
know
them.
that they are or are not.
They actually do know. They do know that the question of how to tweak the results from the past to get to some other future is being left up to them. And they don't particularly like this position either. Okay. I guarantee you that the people at Google did not want the publicity associated with identifying Black people as gorillas. They did not want that at all. But here's a question that I would ask, that I would ask. Can you imagine the uproar if Google did a study right now on how to differentiate Black people from gorillas in image recognition? I mean, you say you want to fix the problem. All right. But an engineer's reaction to that is, let's study the problem. Wait a minute. That means I have to study how Black people differ from gorillas. That's not a viable study to do. And so, it gets very tricky very fast when you go down these paths.
Okay, so you're saying that the people who have the power to decide the data set that they're feeding this learning model don't want the responsibility. Somebody has to take the responsibility. But once they've built this learning model, the fact that the people using it can claim they don't understand how it was built or that they don't.
They fixed the gorilla problem. Do you know how they fixed it? It refuses to output the word gorilla. I mean, that's a way of fixing it. And what they say publicly is the upside of being able to do that is not worth the downside of the racist implications of the statement. They're probably right about that.
Lou, do you have something on?
First, continuation on that question. If that's essentially an insoluble problem, does that make AI not a good solution for that kind of a problem?
You could you could retrain the data. You could retrain it. You could give it a whole lot more image. So it is widely believed that the reason that it does it like this is that the data sets that they used were not sufficiently, did not have enough Black people in it. Okay, which is a perfectly reasonable answer to that. Of course, let me finish. But the problem with retraining it is now you're retraining it, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And by a lot of money, I mean billions of dollars to retrain. So now you get into this question of whether, is it easier just to fix it by saying no gorillas?
Is fixing it by saying no gorillas an adequate solution to that kind of a problem? And if it's too expensive to fix, does that make AI an inappropriate means of solving that problem?
But it's but it's an appropriate means of solving all sorts of other problems. So.
Lou, do you have?
Yeah, yes,
questions?
we do. Marcia's comment is that, Herb, you've described AI as the logical extension of computer technology. Then the question, why is it suddenly the source of so much attention and so much money?
Because there were ways of using it that captured the public imagination and that were released in 2022. That was with ChatGPT, and people started being able to converse with it to interact with it in a conversational way, and people said, "Oh wow!" Of course, this effect is known in the computer science business as the ELIZA effect, after the first chatbot that was ever invented in 1968 by Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT, under whom I studied. It took the MIT community by storm also, as Weizenbaum figured out that people were actually treating it like a person. His secretary asked him to leave the room when she was interacting with it. So it was a really quite amazing phenomenon then, and the same thing showed up in 2022. And as it turns out, these chatbots are able to do things that sometimes people find useful. I use chatbots for a variety of reasons, for a variety of things in helping me do my writing. It is great at shortening. I have a paragraph of 150 words, and I say, please shorten this to 100 words, and it gives me a paragraph of 100 words. And now I have to go through it, and I edit it, and I say, oh, it left out this, it left out that, I can say this better, and so on. And I come out with my final work is 125 words, which is 25 words shorter, which is good. And it's tighter reasoning, and it's got all the points I wanted to make, and so on. It's much better. Don't use it to add, to lengthen a paragraph. Then it'll insert all kinds of crap.
That was the only question we have online, Tom.
Okay, here, Corinne?
Great talk. I was fascinated by your comment about Moore's Law. But can you talk about the use of AI in diagnosing medical conditions and in surgery?
I think that AI can be very good at in a variety of medical contexts. It can certainly be used to interpret your medical records in lay language. That's a very useful thing to do. There's a privacy issue there. You might not want to feed your medical records into ChatGPT. That's a different question. But if you're willing to do that, I would advise you not to. But if you're not worried about that, then you could get some good information out of it, at least enough to prompt a good discussion with your physician. In surgery, we haven't yet, there is robotic surgery around now. By all accounts, robotic surgery, for the applications for which it has been approved, does a much better job than people do, than people can, because it does it with, as they say, robotic precision. It does it, you can do a good job of it. In diagnoses, there are times when it's possible to use AI to flag anomalies that demand human review and attention. It's probably not the right role to use it to replace your radiologist, but it probably is the right. I mean, the things that radiologists see are mostly benign things. Mostly cancer is a rare occurrence. Okay. And so what you want to do is, if you want to use AI to reduce the workload on the radiologist, is to flag all of those things that almost certainly don't require the radiologist's intervention. So I mean, I think I'm answering your question, but okay.
I'd like to ask a follow-up on that for, I'm on a board of an institute. And one of the problems that came up was pharmaceutical companies interested in access to medical records, massive medical records that have been anonymized. And it very quickly bumped up against the privacy wall, because there were aspects of private information, where you live, the environment, age, the kind of stuff that are probably germane to interpreting the anonymized data. Is there anything that you know of that sort of has been done to tackle this problem? Generalizing from the privacy around medical to data that has been identified as useful, but is fenced off for some reason.
I'm going to say something and you let me know if it answers your question, because I'm not sure it does. For people who work in data privacy, there is a theorem that says that, well, a proposition, it's almost a theorem, that says anonymized data isn't. That is, there's no such thing as anonymized data. That it can always be re-identified with enough work and so on. And that seems to be the case. And AI will just make that problem worse. Have I answered your question?
You have, because I mean, I think I agree with the
Okay.
proposition that
Right.
nothing is anonymous. You could, if that's what you want to do, if that's what you want to do, is find out
Right.
who this individual is for whatever reasons. But it's a judgment call about whether protecting set of individuals against hypothetical violations of privacy, leaving unspecified what that means or what the in order to, at the expense of decreasing the ability to have tailored medical intervention to deal with now what are turning out to be an increasing number of rare, because in the sense we didn't identify them before, maladies in there. And I would assume that that is a kind of a general problem, whether it's about financial data, it is around proprietary information that corporations don't want to have out there, that just stymies the process.
Right. And if you want to give me individual benefit, you have to know who I am. And that's right. And that is attention. There's no question about that. If that's what you're saying.
We now have a couple of questions from online, Tom.
Go ahead, Lou.
First, a comment. If AI systems go to the internet to get trained, and there is so much disinformation on the net, does that taint the AI results?
Yes. Next question.
Okay.
Seriously, a lot of people have said who in the AI business is that we're going to stop training on data that was acquired after 2022. Why 2022? Because that's when ChatGPT first came out. And a lot of the stuff that ChatGPT has given us is now back on the net. And so you don't want to be training on that. And so they're only going to train on data that was available prior to 2022. So that point is relevant to what you said. Yes, there's a lot of crap out there, and there's going to be more, and it's going to be interesting. I mean, there are reports that Russia is already doing this now to, you know, flood the net with narratives that are pro-Russian, and that if you're not smart about how the data is that you're collecting and so on, you'll be incorporating Russian narratives into the training of your chatbots.
Okay, the next question is referring to a book called What's the Use by Ian Stewart. He wrote in that publication that a well-known machine learning system that was trained to distinguish cats from other animals was actually fragile. Change a few pixels and what to you and me is still a cat, the system interpreted now as guacamole. Are you aware of this, and does this not make a basic challenge as to whether any AI system really, quote unquote, understands anything?
Yes, I'm aware of it. It goes under the general term in the business called adversarial attack. And the phenomenon is that you take an image and it's recognized as a cat, and then you change a couple of pixels in it in ways that you can't identify if you were looking at the image. Okay, and yet you give it to the computer, and now it says it's guacamole. That's the phenomenon that he's talking about. And it is the phenomenon that you described is well known. And I think you're quite correct when you say it means that these AI systems don't understand anything. They don't. They're just, you know, they are just trying to do the best they can on the basis of the statistics they've gathered on various features on these images. They don't have any idea what a cat is. So you're right.
Let's go in the back here.
You've mentioned a few times that the use of AI to solve problems there are some problems that it may be more well suited for than others. If that's the case, could you suggest or recommend criteria that might be used to determine whether using AI is appropriate in certain circumstances or not? What would come to mind if someone says we should use AI for this? What would you give them as a kind of roadmap for deciding whether it's appropriate?
I studied that particular question in the context of military systems, high-risk systems, and so on. But the more general point is I'm perfectly happy to use it in low-stakes environments. I don't really care whether a recommendation that I get from Amazon, you might like this book too, is not, I don't particularly care if it gets that one wrong, right? Nobody cares. Okay, so that's a perfectly okay use for AI. I mean, let me give you what I regard as the cynic's view of AI. Now, this is what I'm about to say is completely unbalanced because it's the cynic's view, right? You've all been exposed to the argument that says AI is the best thing since sliced bread. Okay, so I'm going to give you the other side. The cynic's view of AI is what you call something that doesn't quite work. Okay, it works some of the time, maybe even most of the time, but not all of the time. You can't predict when it's not going to work. When it's not working, you often don't know that it's not working. When you do know it's not working, you don't know what went wrong, and you don't know how to fix it. Now, if all of those things are okay, and for many, many, many applications, they are, full speed ahead. If you're not okay with any one of those, as you wouldn't be in a high-risk situation, okay, stop and consider what you're doing more carefully. That's sort of that's the general comment that I would make on that.
Could I make an observation? You know that it was in October 2024, the Royal Swedish Academy in October 2024 decided to award the Nobel Prize in Physics to Hopfield and Hinton for the foundational discoveries and in inventions that enable machine learning with artificial neural networks. They got the prize in physics. There's no prize in AI. I learned about this from a podcast in the Babbage column of The Economist, March 12th. And at the end of the interview, Skynet, Colossus, all that stuff, that's one side. But the other side, there are a lot of positives that are potentially possible. One is advances in healthcare. So go listen to that podcast, see what you think.
It's up to you. You're running it, so.
Hi. Over here.
And there's another one over there, and then there's one over here.
Go ahead, Rick.
Okay, I'm going to tell a little experience I had recently and just get your reaction after I tell the experience of my reaction. So I'm trying to get a new cable provider. I'm on live chat, pretty sure it may or may not be. During this problem I'm trying to get resolved so they'll come out and install the cable, it had the little bubbles that come up, which I'm assuming is fake. And then it said, while we're waiting for the answer, would you like to tell me about your week? I wanted to either ignore it, because it's AI, I think, I don't know. I then had another reaction, and then I actually said, I'd rather focus on the task at hand. And it ignored me after that. And then an actual human came to my house and put in the cable. So it has a happy ending. So was I interacting with AI, and how do I adjust myself in the future? Because I'm going to be interacting with AI. What do we do?
I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, I get the same chat bots. Fortunately, I'm reasonably well connected with Silicon Valley. So when I had a problem with a computer that I have right now, I called up a friend who works at the company and says, "Can you put me in touch with a human being there who can help me?" And she did. I mean, that's how that's how, and I had the good fortune to sit next to the president of HP at a meeting. And I made a comment to him about, my daughter really likes the new screen that she got. He was very happy about that. But if I had a problem with that, I would say, "Can you please help me with this problem?" And he would have helped me. I mean, it's in his interest to be nice to somebody that he meets at a meeting. So,
Well, I chose to be nice to what may not have been a human being.
I understand. There's an interesting question. There's a research question, and nobody knows the answer to this. If you're polite to your chatbot, you get better answers. Nobody knows the answer to that question, but it is a question that's been raised. Do you say please? Sure.
Yes, take this one.
Several years ago, there was a lot of comment from Washington, D.C., particularly as regards to defense, about how to obtain the logic of an AI system. An AI system comes out with a recommendation. The question becomes, on what basis does it come? Has any progress been made on that, and where does it stand?
What the gentleman here is talking about is the problem of, quote, explainable AI. And that is the question of, how do you know an AI is doing what it comes to the reasoning behind the answer that it gives you. Okay, why did you say that? There is an interesting phenomenon. I described to you the statistical basis earlier about correlations between different words and so on. You remember that? If you remember from statistics, the thing that you learn on day one is correlation is not causation, right? So as long as this thing is based on statistics and doesn't use anything else but statistics, you're never going to get anything resembling a causal explanation. And for most people, causality is what drives an explanation. There are sometimes when a correlative explanation, statistical explanation, is quite sufficient. But in which case it's fine. But there are times when you need a causal explanation, and it's not going to give it to you. So this is an example of what I think is a fundamental area that's missing. They're doing what they can to give you better correlative explanations, and that's good. I mean, it says what are the variables that correlate with that. That's a good thing to do, but it's by far not enough. We had one question over here and one over there.
So,
And I do have one more question
Oh,
online.
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay,
Will.
so in direct
Take your-
follow-up to what you just said.
We'll take the one in the room here first, Lou, and then do you.
Go ahead.
Okay, so in direct follow-up to what you just said, certainly out in the world that we're observing, correlation and causation are different. Okay. And correlation may not be causation. But you're describing a computer system which has collected correlations and is now outputting stuff as a result of the correlations that it's observed. So it's certainly true that a processed correlation does not indicate causation in the real world, but it might indicate the data processing path within the machine. So if we're only asking for explainable AI, we can ask for the AI to say which data, which correlations fed into this AI caused you to say that.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
if you want to, like, for example, you're in a medical application and you want to know the chain of deductions that led to something that's now a lawsuit, you could get that chain of deductions. It doesn't say anything
Not the
about
chain of
it doesn't
deductions.
say anything about causation in the real world. It does only talk about what happens inside the machine. Right.
You don't get the causation, you don't get the chain of deductions. What you get is the identification of the data that contributed.
That's fine. Yeah, okay.
Lou?
Yes, this question is about the Turing test for establishing true intelligence in the 21st century. So here's the question. Do you feel it is valid for determining whether a 21st century AI system is truly intelligent?
Okay. Have you ever had somebody answer a question that you asked with another question? When a computer does that, I'll start paying attention. When a computer, no, because you can always arrange it to do that. But the question is, does it do it appropriately? Have you ever had an instance where somebody says, where somebody asks you, you're talking about something, and says, let me tell you a story, right? And the story is exactly on point and makes, and tells you the story, gives you an answer, sort of in an allegorical or analogical manner, and so on. You say, and that was really an answer to the question. Okay. When a computer starts doing that, when a computer asks me the questions that my 6-year-old used to ask me, then I'll start paying attention to it. The thing that's been totally dispiriting to me is how satisfied and how easily people are taken in with the Turing test. They're satisfied with basically nothing. I will also tell you, apropos, this is not limited to computers, okay? It is possible in Japan to hire an actor that will play you at a family reunion, okay? And I'm going to make this up. For $10 an hour, you get the basic briefing. And for $100 an hour, you find out a lot about your life and you could actually respond as though the actor can actually respond as you. Now, how do I know this? Because one of these actors has filed a lawsuit against the parent of somebody who hired him to go to the meeting. Why? Because this parent beat him up. Why would he beat him up? Because he simulated his son too accurately. Okay? And, this is crazy, right? This is another example of the Turing test. No, people are not, this is nuts. And the Turing test is way too simple. I mean, it only tests your ability to answer certain kinds of questions. Doesn't test your ability to ask questions. So.
I'm going to ask one final question because we're approaching the end point. And that has to do with, are there differences in the way one should think about AI? An AI as a processor of lots of information that can give you explanations, tell you what is going on, and the use of AI to tell you what to do about the situation that it has just described. That the former, enhanced understanding of what's going on, that's sort of what I did for all the years that I was in the intelligence analysis business, to help other people to understand the situation in which they would make decisions. That seems to me is very different from saying the machine processed all the information and what you want to do is X. The receptivity to the former is pretty high. To the latter, very low. Any thoughts or enlighten us on that dimension of the problem?
On Google, there used to be a button underneath it when you typed in a search, and it said, "I'm feeling lucky." Okay. And what it would do is it would give you the top ranked search. And it would eliminate all of the uncertainty about all those other links down below it. So it seems to me that you can either reveal the uncertainty or hide it, but it's still there. And so, I guess, I don't like the idea of hiding uncertainty, which is, the second option that you described. I don't know. It's an interesting question. There are certain political leaders that I might want to give an answer to and not confuse them with a lot of other options. I mean, that's a really important question as to how you design an interface and customize it for the needs of the particular person involved. I mean, maybe the right answer is don't elect a person who isn't willing to consider alternatives. I mean, wouldn't that be a novel idea?
Well, on that, I'm not sure if it's a happy note or an unhappy note, but thank you, Herb, for, to me, a terrifically interesting and informative evening, for giving us the time and for working on a subject that to most of us is omnipresent and arcane.
Okay.
Now, we have one more session in this year's Great Decision Series, and that's next week. Mona Tajali, who is a visiting fellow at Stanford, is going to talk on the Middle East and U.S. policy, but her real specialty is the changing societal situation with respect to women and women's place in the societies in the Middle East. So we will thank Herb here, and then I'll turn it back over to Lou.
I want to do something here. Herb, in response to your answer to the Turing test question, the person who asked the question gave you 2 thumbs up. And he wanted to make sure that I let you know that. Thank you very much for attending. Those of you who are online, you will use the same registration info that you received earlier for next week's session. And with that, I am going to stop the recording and then go ahead and stop the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you very much for the excellent discussion. It was very, very enlightening. Thank you very much. The recording will now stop and then the meeting will end. Good night.